Chapter 31. The Road to the Capital. Wren talked her way onto the trip, in roughly the amount of time it took Corvina to finish her tea. "I'm coming," she announced, at the small farewell gathering the chapel threw the night before departure, in a tone that left very little room for negotiation. Someone needs to make sure he doesn't accidentally offend an entire noble house by explaining gear ratios at them for 40 minutes, and Fen can't leave the scrapyard. And I refuse to just sit here imagining what capital nonsense you're getting into without me. "That's not really how guild travel authorizations work," Halden started. "I'm an F-rank scribe," Wren said. "I can write things down accurately. That is, extremely specifically, my entire class function. You're telling me the guild classification hearing for an unprecedented anomaly class doesn't need a single competent scribe present to document it correctly?" Halden looked at Corvina. Corvina, who had clearly already decided this battle wasn't worth having, simply smiled and said, "I'll arrange the paperwork." And that was, as far as anyone in the room was concerned, that. The road to the capital took 9 days by carriage, and Kael spent most of the first 3 staring out the window at country he'd never seen before, valleys and river towns, and, on the 5th day, a stretch of open plains so flat and empty it made the Ashwood Deep's crowded darkness feel, in retrospect, almost cozy. "You've genuinely never left the valley," Corvina said, watching his face on the 5th morning with something between amusement and quiet sorrow. "Not once, in 15 years, never had a reason to." "Well," she gestured out the window, at the enormous, unfamiliar sky. "Consider this a reason." Wren, for her part, treated the entire journey as an ongoing research expedition, interrogating every inn owner, carriage driver, and fellow traveler they encountered about capital customs, capital fashion, and, with an intensity that made Kael deeply suspicious, capital food, until by the 7th day she had produced a small, extremely detailed notebook of things not to do in front of nobles, which she read aloud at dinner with the solemnity of scripture. "Rule 4, she announced. "Do not, under any circumstances, refer to a noble's family crest as kind of busy, honestly." "When did I say that?" "You were going to say that. I know you, Kael. I'm getting ahead of it." He practiced synthesis every evening they stopped, partly out of habit, partly because Ashen had pointed out, not unreasonably, that a month of dedicated preparation shouldn't pause just because the scenery had changed. Old Scuttle rode the entire 9 days in his coat pocket, poking its dented head out at every new town like a small, judgmental tourist, to Corvina's open and increasing delight. By the 8th night, working with unfamiliar riverbed clay instead of deep scavenged scrap, he managed something that made even Ashen pause. System notification. New adaptive application. Synthesis using non-standard, non-rift-touched materials. Success. Operator. Your material dependency was assumed to be tied to rift residue density. This result suggests otherwise. Recommend further testing. This may be significant. Significant. How? If synthesis functions on ordinary material with only modest efficiency loss, your operational range is far larger than I had modeled. It would mean you are not limited to places the deep has touched. It would mean, operator, that you could build almost anywhere. Kael looked down at the small, unremarkable clay construct sitting in his palm, built from nothing but riverbank mud and 9 days of practice, and felt something settle into place that had nothing to do with the capital at all. They reached the outskirts of Aurelia on the morning of the 9th day, and Kael, leaning out the carriage window for his first look at the city that held the answer to half his questions, went very, very quiet. Chapter 32. Aurelia. Nothing Wren's notebook or Corvina's careful descriptions had prepared him for it. Ashen Reach had one temple. Aurelia had entire districts organized around competing ones. Ashen Reach's market square could have fit, Kael estimated, somewhere around 30 times inside the merchant quarter alone. And that was before the carriage even reached the wide, white-stoned avenue that led up toward the Guildhall's central spire, visible from nearly anywhere in the city, a needle of pale stone that seemed to catch and hold the morning light like it had personally arranged for good weather. "Breathe," Wren said, elbowing him gently. "You've gone the color of Father Bastian's flower again." "I'm fine." "You are extremely not fine, but that's all right. I'm not fine either. I just hide it better. For what it is worth, operator, my own sensory data on this city is entirely second-hand, filtered through your eyes. I find I am experiencing something adjacent to your own overwhelm, which is a novel data point about myself I did not expect to gather today. Comforting to know even you're rattled." "I did not say rattled. I said adjacent to overwhelm. There is a difference, and I intend to maintain it." The carriage didn't take them to the Guildhall first, though. Corvina had insisted, gently but firmly, that Kael see the Solari house before anything official happened, so that at least one part of this city gets to feel like it's actually yours before the guild makes it feel like paperwork. It was a tall, handsome townhouse in the old merchant quarter. Not a palace by any stretch, its stone facade weathered with genuine age rather than ostentation. A modest, sunburst crest, the same one Kael recognized from the very first letter, carved simply above the door. An older woman was waiting on the steps when the carriage pulled up, silver hair pinned severely back, dressed in dark, unfussy morning clothes that Kael understood. With a lurch she had probably been wearing in some form or another for 15 years. "That's my mother," Corvina said quietly, before he could ask. "Your grandmother, Aurelia." A pause. Careful. "She's not going to be easy tonight, Kael. She's spent 15 years grieving a daughter and a grandson at the same time. And grief that old doesn't just switch off because the second half of it turned out to be wrong. Be patient with her. She loves you already. She just doesn't know yet how to show it without it hurting." Aurelia Solari came down the steps slowly, studying Kael with an intensity that made him want to fidget, made him understand, suddenly and completely, exactly where Corvina's careful composure had come from in the first place. "You have your mother's chin," she said, finally, her voice not quite steady. "I told myself, all these years, that if I ever actually saw you again, I'd have something better prepared to say than that. Apparently I did not." "That's all right," Kael said, and found, to his own surprise, that it genuinely was. "I didn't have anything prepared either." Ophelia's composure cracked, just slightly, just for a moment. And then she reached out, hesitant the way Corvina had been hesitant, and pulled him into an embrace that startled him with how fiercely, how immediately, it felt like something he'd been missing his whole life without knowing its shape. "Welcome home," she said, into his shoulder, and Kael, standing on the steps of a house he'd never seen before, in a city he'd never visited, found that the word, home, didn't feel like it was fighting with Ashenreach for space in his chest at all. It just felt like it had made room. Chapter 33. House Solari. Wren, predictably, was a menace within the hour. "You have a library," she said to Aurelia at dinner, with the specific reverence usually reserved for religious sites. "A whole room, just for books. Kael, do you understand what this means? I could live in this house forever." "You're welcome to visit the library any time you'd like, dear," Aurelia said, and Kael watched, fascinated, as his grandmother's careful formality softened around Wren's unfiltered enthusiasm, in a way he suspected very few things in this house had managed to soften it in 15 years. Kael's mother used to hide in there for entire afternoons. I always assumed it skipped a generation with Corvina, who never sat still long enough to finish a chapter. "I have finished several chapters," Corvina said, mildly, from across the table. "Of correspondence, dear, not literature." It went like that for most of the meal. Small, easy jabs, the particular rhythm of a family that had spent generations learning exactly where each other's soft spots were, and mostly avoiding them out of love rather than lack of aim. And Kael found himself watching more than participating, cataloging it the way he cataloged everything unfamiliar, looking for the mechanism underneath. "You're doing the thing," Ren murmured to him, halfway through dessert. "The thing where you go quiet and stare at people like their gear ratios." "I'm not staring." "You're absolutely staring." "It's fine. I'd stare too." "This is a lot of family for someone who spent 15 years thinking he didn't have any." Aurelia caught the tail end of that, and her expression, for a moment, went soft and sad in a way that made Kael's chest ache. "You don't have to catch up all at once," she said. "We've waited 15 years, Kael. We can be patient a little longer while you decide how much of this you actually want." "I want it," Kael said, surprising himself with how immediately the words came. "I just don't know how to want it and still be myself." The person Ashenreach made. "I'm worried they're going to turn out to be two different people, and I only get to keep one." Aurelia set down her fork, considering that with genuine care rather than a quick reassurance. "My daughter Elena," she said finally. "Your mother, she used to say something similar before she left for that expedition, that she loved this house and everything in it, and she still needed to go see what else the world had to offer, and that wanting both things didn't make her ungrateful for either one." She reached over, rested a hand briefly on his. "I think, if she could see you now, she'd tell you the exact same thing I'm about to. You don't have to choose, Kael. You just have to be honest about which one is home on which day." "That's allowed." Later that night, unable to sleep, Kael wandered down to the library Ren had already half-claimed as her own personal territory, and found, tucked into a locked glass case near the back, a small collection of his mother's research notes, expedition logs, sketches of rift residue patterns, careful handwriting that looked, disconcertingly, almost like his own. "Operator," Ashen said quietly, as Kael pressed his palm flat against the case, feeling for something he couldn't quite name. "I would recommend caution before requesting access to those. Some of what is likely inside may be difficult to read. Grief has a way of looking different on paper than it does in a person's face." "I know. I still want to see it. Then I will be here when you do." Kael found the case unlocked the next morning, sitting open on the reading table with a short, unsigned note beside it, in Auphelia's careful hand. "Whenever you're ready. No rush at all." Chapter 34. The Kestrel Family. The guild hall's training courtyards were, Kael decided within about 30 seconds of arriving, exactly as intimidating as the spire had promised. Wide, sun-bleached stone yards ringed with practice grounds, where Capital Academy trainees drilled in organized formations, none of them looking remotely as ragged or improvised as anything Ashenreach's outpost had ever produced. Halden met them at the gate, already dressed for formal guild business, and walked them through toward the administrative wing, with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd clearly spent the last week fielding questions about her unusual provincial case. "Hearings in 4 days," she said. "High Adjudicator Kestrel is presiding personally, which is either very good news or very bad news depending on how the next 4 days go. She doesn't preside over provincial cases unless she's already decided they matter." "That's not reassuring." "It's not meant to be. It's meant to be accurate." Halden paused at a junction in the corridor, lowering her voice slightly. "One more thing. Adjudicator Kestrel's niece trains here, top of her cohort, A-rank track. Swordswoman specializing in a style I genuinely don't have the vocabulary to describe well. She's going to hear about you before the hearing, because everyone in this building is going to hear about you before the hearing. I'd recommend not letting her get under your skin if she comes looking." She came looking within the hour. Ileana Kestrel found them in the courtyard where Kael had gone, restless, to run a synthesis drill while he waited for Corvina to finish an errand, and she watched, arms crossed, silent and unreadable, through the entire process of him raising a small, crude construct out of packed gravel before finally speaking. "So you're the provincial anomaly everyone's whispering about. That's one way to put it. I watched Halden's incident report get passed around the senior officers' mess for a week," Ileana said, circling the construct with open, clinical curiosity that didn't quite manage to hide the skepticism underneath it. Duskhound Alpha, Long Watcher, a B-rank jump in a single field engagement. Half the Academy thinks it's exaggerated. The other half thinks you got extremely lucky 3 separate times. She looked up at him, sharp and evaluating. I don't believe in luck that consistent, which means either the reports are wrong or you're something the guild genuinely hasn't seen before, and I intend to find out which before the hearing does. Is that a threat? It's an invitation. She unslung the practice blade from her back with the easy confidence of someone who'd never once doubted her own competence. Spar with me. Not for rank, not for the hearing. I want to see what you actually do under real pressure. From someone who isn't going to hold back out of politeness. Operator. This individual's Aether signature is far stronger than a standard Academy trainee's. Recommend caution. And, separately, recommend accepting. Her assessment of you will likely reach the hearing panel regardless of what you decide. Better she forms it from direct observation than second-hand rumor. Kael looked at Ileana Kestrel, poised, certain, entirely unimpressed by anything she'd heard about him so far, and felt something in his chest that had been mostly dormant since the Long Watcher's streambed finally stir back to life. All right, he said. Let's find out. Chapter 35. Proving it again. Word of the spar traveled fast enough that by the time Kael and Ileana squared off in the courtyard's practice ring, a genuine crowd of Academy trainees had gathered along the edges, murmuring, clearly expecting either a very short fight or an unexpected upset. Rules, Ileana said, rolling her shoulders. No lethal synthesis, obviously. First clean hit, or first concession, wins. And Rennick, I'd appreciate it if you actually tried. I don't want a story going around that I beat a provincial anomaly who was holding back out of politeness. I wasn't planning on holding back. Good. She was fast, faster than anything Kael had fought so far, faster than the Duskhound Alpha, faster than the Long Watcher's opening charge. And for the first 10 seconds of the spar, he did almost nothing but retreat, throwing up hastily synthesized gravel barriers that she cut through, one after another, with an economy of motion that made his best work look, by comparison, like a child stacking blocks. Operator. Direct defense is not working. Recommend the approach you used against the Sandjaw pack. Distribute. Don't concentrate. Kael dropped low, palms hitting the courtyard's packed sand, and instead of one barrier, scattered a dozen small shapes across the ring floor at once. Not to block her, but to force her to actually account for a dozen separate points of attention instead of one straightforward line. Ileana's blade found 3 of them in as many seconds, but the 4th, 5th, and 6th bought him exactly what he needed. Half a second of broken rhythm. Her focus split just enough. He used it to drop a construct directly behind her, low to the ground, and thought at it, now. And it clipped her ankle hard enough to throw her stride. Not enough to hurt her, enough to make her stumble half a step off balance for the first time in the entire match. She recovered in an instant, blade already coming around, but Kael, already moving, already committed, closed the gap she'd opened and pressed a synthesized gravel plate flat against her sword arm before she could bring the blade fully to bear, locking it, just for a moment, just long enough. The courtyard went very quiet. Concession, Ileana said, after a pause, lowering her blade. And there was something in her voice that hadn't been there before. Not defeat, exactly, but genuine, recalculated respect. I've sparred 40 different trainees this season, and none of them have made me stumble like that. I got lucky. You did not get lucky. You identified my rhythm and broke it on purpose, twice, with constructs you were building in real time under pressure. She studied him, something almost like a grudging smile pulling at the corner of her mouth. The reports weren't exaggerated at all, were they? Some of them undersold it, actually, said a familiar voice from the courtyard's edge, and Kael turned to find Ren, arms crossed, grinning ear to ear. Having apparently abandoned the library long enough to watch, you should ask him what he named the little ankle-biter. Go on. Ask him. Ileana, against her better judgment, asked. Scuttle, Kael admitted. That's... Ileana looked, genuinely, like she didn't know whether to laugh or be professionally offended on behalf of synthesis as a discipline. You named a construct that just beat an A-rank track swordswoman Scuttle. It's the 31st one. I ran out of ideas a while back. That is the single worst thing I've heard all season, Ileana said, and then, unable to help herself, actually laughed. Short, surprised, entirely genuine, and something in the courtyard's air shifted, quietly, from rivalry into something that might, with a little more time, become an actual friendship. Chapter 36. Questions without answers. He finally opened the glass case 2 nights before the hearing. Alone. With Ashen a quiet, steady presence behind his ribs, and the rest of the house long since asleep. His mother's handwriting was neat, precise, full of the same instinct to underline and annotate that Kael recognized uncomfortably well from his own habit of narrating gear ratios out loud to nobody. The early expedition logs were mostly technical. Rift residue density measurements, notes on ambient aether concentration near the deep's edge, cross-references to older guild survey data, ordinary research, careful and thorough, right up until the final week's entries, where the handwriting changed, tighter, faster, less careful about the margins. Residue readings near Site 7 don't match any known pattern. Concentration is climbing on a schedule, not randomly. Something is stable enough to measure. C thinks I'm imagining a signal in noise. I don't think I am. Requesting additional guild oversight before we proceed further. Corwin agrees. The next entry, dated 4 days later, was shorter and colder in a way that made Kael's stomach turn. Oversight request denied at the district level. Reason given, insufficient evidence to justify delay. Reason I actually believe, someone doesn't want this looked at closely. Site 7 readings continue to climb. We move camp at dawn regardless of the denial. I don't like this. I don't like this at all. There was no entry after that. The log simply stopped. 4 days before the rift event that had killed both his parents, and, by every account Kael had, swallowed him whole. Ashen, he said quietly, into the dark of the library. Someone doesn't want this looked at closely. That's not paranoia talking. That's someone specific. I concur that this reads as more than academic frustration. I would caution against building a full theory from a single fragmentary journal. Operator. Grief and suspicion can look similar on the page, and I do not want you to mistake one for the other out of a need for the tragedy to have a villain instead of simply being a tragedy. A pause. Careful. That said, the phrase insufficient evidence to justify delay is precisely the kind of bureaucratic language that gets used both honestly and dishonestly in roughly equal measure. I do not know which this was. I would very much like to. Do you think it's connected? To you? To whoever stripped your designation? I do not know. The timing is suggestive. I have learned, across whatever fragments of memory I retain, to be wary of suggestive timing that has no supporting evidence behind it. Another pause. Longer. But I will say this much. Operator, plainly. If someone with authority in this district denied your mother's request for oversight 4 days before a catastrophic, statistically unlikely rift event killed her and misplaced you for 15 years, that is a coincidence worth investigating properly by people with the standing to actually do so. Not alone. In a library. At midnight. By a 15-year-old with an understandable and very dangerous motive to want an answer immediately. Kael sat with that for a long moment. His mother's careful, worried handwriting still open in front of him, and felt something cold and determined settle in alongside the grief. After the hearing, he said, finally, I'll bring this to Halden. Properly. Not alone. That is the correct decision, operator. I want to note, for the record, that I did not expect you to actually make it. This is growth. You could just say you're proud of me. I could. I am choosing, instead, to say that this is growth. Let us not push our luck 2 nights before a guild hearing. Kael closed the case carefully, the way you'd close something that mattered, and went to bed with his mother's suspicion sitting heavy and unresolved in his chest, and did not, that night, manage very much sleep at all. Chapter 37. The hearing begins. The guild's great assessment chamber was, Kael decided, specifically designed to make a person feel small. A wide, high-ceilinged amphitheater of pale stone. 3 raised adjudicator seats at its center facing outward toward a modest platform where he now stood. Alone, Ren and Corvina and Ophelia, watching from a gallery he could see but not reach. High adjudicator Petra Kestrel sat at the center of the 3, silver-haired like her sister, sharper-featured than her niece. And the moment she began speaking, Kael understood immediately where Ileana had learned to project that particular brand of unhurried, evaluating certainty. This hearing is convened to formally assess and classify an anomalous awakening designated, provisionally, Machinist, she said, voice carrying easily across the chamber without any apparent effort. The Guild Talent Division has submitted extensive field reports. The subject's Aether signature has been preliminarily analyzed and found to match no registered class taxonomy currently in use. This panel's task, over the coming 2 days, is to determine 3 things: whether this represents a genuine unclassified ability, a corrupted or misapplied existing classification, or— her gaze flicked briefly toward Kael. Not unkind, but entirely without softness, something requiring further containment protocol before classification can safely proceed. Kael's stomach dropped at the word containment, and he felt Ashen's presence go very still and very alert behind his ribs. That is standard procedural language, operator. Not a threat, specifically. But I would recommend performing exceptionally well today regardless. That's very reassuring. I did not say it to reassure you. I said it because it is accurate, and because I believe you perform better when you understand the actual stakes rather than a softened version of them. The first several hours were almost entirely questions. Halden's field reports read into record, Joran's account of the Alpha and the Long Watcher summoned by written testimony. Denner's registration paperwork cross-examined line by line by a second adjudicator. A narrow, precise man named Vale Ostrin, who seemed to specialize in finding inconsistencies in exactly the kind of hastily filed provincial documentation Denner had produced under crisis conditions. The registration slip lists Inventor, F rank, Ostrin noted, dry and pointed. Every subsequent rank reassessment was performed in the field, under combat conditions, by officers without full resonance lamp equipment. I would like the subject to explain, directly, why we should trust field assessments over a controlled ceremony reading. Because the ceremony reading was wrong, Kael said, before he could think better of phrasing it quite that bluntly, and heard a faint, badly suppressed noise from the gallery that he was fairly sure was Ren trying not to laugh. It read what was on the surface. It didn't have the tools to read what was underneath. Every field assessment since has measured something the original ceremony genuinely couldn't see. Ostrin's expression didn't change, but he made a note, unhurried, and moved on to the next question. And Kael understood, distantly, exhausted, that this was going to be a very long 2 days. The third adjudicator, a broad, weathered man who'd said almost nothing all afternoon, introduced only as Adjudicator Marrow, finally spoke as the session drew toward its close, his voice low and considering. "Enough questions for today," he said. "Tomorrow, we stop asking about what you've done, and we watch you do it." He looked at Kael directly for the first time, something unreadable in his weathered face. "Get some rest, boy. Tomorrow's the part that actually decides this." Chapter 38. Trial by panel. The second day's gallery was noticeably fuller than the first. Word of a genuine unclassified anomaly had apparently traveled through the guild hall overnight, And Kael, scanning the crowd from the platform before the session began, felt his stomach do something complicated when he spotted a familiar face he hadn't expected to see at all. Seraphine, dressed formally, sitting beside a man who could only be her father, gave him the smallest, most controlled nod imaginable, which from Seraphine Kael had learned was roughly equivalent to anyone else jumping up and down and waving both arms. District governors received formal invitation to observe classification hearings involving their own awakeners' field data, Holden murmured, catching his confused glance. Lord Alcairn's daughter fought alongside you against the Long Watcher. That makes her a material witness, technically. I suspect technically did a great deal of convincing on her part. That sounds like her. Focus, Rennick. You've got a demonstration to survive. The controlled demonstration, it turned out, was considerably more elaborate than Halden's field test back in Miller's Field had been. A sealed testing yard behind the assessment chamber, warded on all sides, containing a live, restrained beast the panel had procured specifically for the occasion. A mid-tier duskhound, muzzled and chained but very much awake, very much aware, snarling at the assembled adjudicators with undisguised hostility. You will demonstrate full-spectrum capability, Adjudicator Kestrel said, from the observation platform above the yard. Communion, synthesis, and combat application against a live threat, under controlled release. The restraint will be removed once you signal readiness. This panel has authorized non-lethal engagement only on both sides. Kael took a breath, knelt at the yard's edge, and felt for the familiar thread of aether in his chest. Steadier now than it had ever been. 3 months and a hearing's worth of pressure notwithstanding, and had just begun raising the first swarm cluster from the packed testing yard sand when something went visibly, immediately wrong. The restraint chain, old and poorly maintained by whatever junior guild staff had prepped the yard, snapped clean at a weak weld the moment the duskhound lunged against it in genuine panic at the sudden surge of unfamiliar aether. And the beast, no longer restrained at all, no longer performing for a controlled demonstration, went straight for the nearest exposed target, Adjudicator Marrow, standing closest to the yard's low outer wall, weathered but unarmed. Caught entirely off guard, the chamber erupted into shouting. Kael didn't have time to think, didn't have time to calculate the safest, most impressive, most panel-friendly response. He simply reacted, the way 3 months of drills had trained his body to react faster than his mind could second-guess, throwing everything he had into a single dense wall of packed sand and scrap directly between the charging duskhound and the wall Marrow stood beside. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't the full-spectrum demonstration the panel had asked for. It was a single, ugly, desperate barrier, thrown up half a second before impact, that took the duskhound's full charge and held, groaning and cracking under the strain, just long enough for Halden and 2 other guild officers to close in and subdue the beast properly. Silence fell over the testing yard, complete and absolute, until Adjudicator Marrow, breathing hard but entirely unharmed, looked down at the crude, cracked wall that had just saved his life and let out a short, disbelieving laugh. Well, he said, to the chamber at large, I believe that answers the question of combat application rather more thoroughly than the scheduled demonstration would have. High Adjudicator Kestrel, for her part, said nothing at all for a long moment, simply looked at Kael, kneeling exhausted in the sand beside the ruins of a construct that had never been meant to be his real test. And something in her sharp, evaluating face shifted, quietly, into a decision made. Chapter 39. Verdict. The panel deliberated for 6 hours, which Kael spent almost entirely pacing a small waiting chamber, while Ren attempted, with limited success, to distract him with an increasingly elaborate ranking of every capital dessert she'd sampled so far. The honeyed fig tart, she said, for the 3rd time, is genuinely life-changing, Kael. You need to try it before we leave. I don't care what the panel says. I care what the panel says a great deal, actually. I know. I'm trying to help. It's not working. I can see that it's not working. She sat down next to him, dropping the performance. For what it's worth, whatever they decide, you already proved what you needed to prove. You caught a beast before it hurt someone, in front of the strictest panel in the entire kingdom, with a construct you built in half a second under real panic. That's not something a piece of paper can take away from you, whatever word they end up putting on it. Corvina and Aurelia arrived together 20 minutes before the panel finally called them back, both of them wearing the specific tight-shouldered tension of people trying very hard not to visibly worry in front of him. And Seraphine slipped in a few minutes after, quiet, standing at the back of the small crowd without announcing herself, which Kael noticed immediately and appreciated more than he had words for. The chamber, when they finally filed back in, felt different than it had the day before. Less like a trial, somehow. Though Kael couldn't have said exactly why until High Adjudicator Kestrel began speaking. This panel finds, she said, that the awakening designated machinist represents a genuine, previously unclassified ability, consistent with fragmentary archive references predating standardized guild taxonomy. We further find, based on demonstrated capability, that this classification is not merely legitimate but historically significant, the first confirmed reawakening of this class in recorded guild memory. She paused, and something almost like warmth entered her formal, measured voice for the first time in 2 full days. Effective immediately, Kael Rennick's classification is amended in full guild record. Machinist, B rank. Confirmed and unrestricted. A permanent registry entry has been created for this class, the first addition to formal guild taxonomy in over a century. The gallery, Kael realized distantly, was applauding. Not the polite, obligatory kind he remembered from every awakening day the resonance lamp had ever sputtered its dim brown-gray light over someone's head, but something real, something that made his chest ache in a way he hadn't expected. And near the gallery's back row, he spotted a face it took him a full 3 seconds to place. Silver-haired, travel-worn, the particular patience of someone who had performed the awakening ceremony in 40 towns before his. The adjudicator, who had once stood on a platform in Ashenreach and read out Inventor, F rank, over a sputtering brown-gray light, while a whole town laughed. She wasn't applauding. She was writing, carefully, in a small field ledger, and when she caught him looking, she stopped, inclined her head once, slowly, in the unmistakable manner of a professional formally amending a record, and Kael understood that somewhere in that ledger a 2-year-old entry had just been corrected in person. One further matter, Adjudicator Marrow added, once the applause settled, his face unreadable. Given the nature of the incident during yesterday's demonstration, and the questions it raises about equipment maintenance standards and controlled testing, this panel is formally opening a review into the restraint failure, separately from your case, but I suspect not entirely unrelated to the concerns your own field reports have already raised about denied oversight requests 15 years prior. Some patterns, Master Rennick, are worth taking seriously the second time they appear, even if the first time was dismissed as coincidence. Kael's breath caught. He hadn't told anyone on this panel about his mother's journal. I did, Ashen said quietly, before he could ask. I asked Halden to submit it as supporting context this morning, with your grandmother's permission, while you were pacing. I judged that you had earned the right to bring it forward properly, as you decided 2 nights ago. And I judged that properly did not require you to be the one standing alone under a panel's scrutiny while you did it. Kael, standing in the middle of a chamber full of applause he'd never expected to earn, felt something in his chest that he didn't have a clean word for yet. Gratitude, maybe. Or something close enough to it that the distinction didn't matter. Thank you, he said, quietly, to no one the room could see. You are welcome, operator. Now, if you would kindly go greet your family before your grandmother starts crying in a room full of guild officials, I believe that would be the appropriate next step.